Get back! I said get back now! Officer Raymond Keller's voice cracked through the misty morning air like a whip, his service weapon drawn and pointed directly at the chest of a tall black man in a crisp military dress uniform. The funeral had come to a complete standstill. Mourners froze mid-prayer, their collective gasp creating a vacuum of silence that made Keller's harsh breathing audible to everyone present. The man at the end of Keller's gun barrel didn't flinch. 4 silver stars gleamed on each shoulder of his immaculate uniform, catching the pale sunlight filtering through the cemetery's oak trees. His hands remained calmly at his sides, his expression a controlled mask that revealed nothing of the storm that must have been raging inside him. "Sir, I'm going to need you to lower your weapon immediately." General Marcus Washington's voice was measured, authoritative, but somehow still quiet. A voice accustomed to command without needing to shout. "There are children present." Officer Keller's finger twitched against the trigger. Sweat beaded on his forehead despite the cool morning air. His eyes darted briefly to the gathered mourners, some of whom had begun to reach for their phones. "I said back up. You don't give me orders." Behind him, Keller's partner, Officer James Rodriguez, stood paralyzed, his own hand hovering uncertainly over his holster. He was younger than Keller, barely 3 years on the force, and the tension in his face betrayed his internal conflict. "Ray," he whispered urgently, taking a half-step forward. "Ray, I don't care who he thinks he is," Keller snarled, his eyes never leaving the general. His knuckles whitened around the grip of his service weapon. "He matches the description. Dark skin, 6 feet tall, black suit. He was acting suspicious around the vehicles." The truth hung in the air, unspoken but understood by every witness. General Marcus Washington had been checking on his elderly mother, helping her from the car to her wheelchair before returning to adjust the parking brake. His crime was attending his own father's funeral while black. A soft sob broke the tense silence. Catherine Washington, an elegant woman in her 80s, sat rigidly in her wheelchair, her arthritic hands clutching a handkerchief embroidered with her late husband's initials. The pain in her eyes was not just grief for her husband of 60 years, but fresh anguish at watching her son, her only child, with a gun pointed at his chest on the day they were meant to lay his father to rest. What Officer Raymond Keller couldn't see, what his rage and prejudice had blinded him to, were the dozens of phones recording his every word, every movement, every twitch of his finger against the trigger of a gun pointed at one of the most decorated military leaders in the country. He couldn't see that this moment would cost him everything: his badge, his freedom, and ultimately, decades of his life. In exactly 14 minutes, General Washington would be surrounded by his fellow mourners, protected and revered. And Officer Keller would be face down on the pavement, handcuffed by his own colleagues, his career finished and his future sealed. But neither man knew that yet. All they knew was this moment, suspended in time, where power, race, and justice collided at the end of a loaded gun. Before we dive deeper into this shocking confrontation, tell me where you're watching from in the comments below. If this kind of abuse of power makes your blood boil, hit that subscribe button and give this video a like. Now let's rewind to understand how this moment came to be, and more importantly, the stunning consequences that would follow. The day had begun with a solemn dignity befitting the funeral of Sergeant Major William Washington, a Korean War veteran and respected community leader in the small city of Lakeside, Virginia. The cemetery was filled with mourners dressed in black, military personnel in formal uniforms, and family members supporting Catherine Washington, the 83-year-old widow who now faced life without her husband of 60 years. Dawn had broken with a fine mist hanging over Lakeside, a picturesque town nestled in Virginia's rolling hills. Catherine Washington had risen at 5 a.m., unable to sleep. She'd spent the early morning hours in the rocking chair William had built for her when they first moved into their modest 2-story home in 1965. She'd rocked slowly, methodically, clutching his old service photograph, her mind swimming with memories of their life together. Their son, Marcus, had arrived the previous evening. His military bearing softened only slightly when he embraced his mother. He'd helped her select the dark navy suit William had requested to be buried in, the same suit he'd worn to their 50th anniversary celebration. "Dad always did look sharp in navy," Marcus had said softly, his fingers brushing the lapel with reverence. Now, hours later, among them was their son, four-star General Marcus Washington, who had flown in from the Pentagon where he served as the deputy chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. At 58, General Washington had followed in his father's military footsteps and risen to become one of the highest-ranking officers in the United States Armed Forces. His distinguished career included 2 Purple Hearts, leadership during 3 major conflicts, and a reputation for uncompromising integrity that had earned him respect across political divides. The general's close-cropped hair had silvered at the temples, giving him a distinguished appearance that, combined with his ramrod-straight posture and measured movements, commanded respect without demanding it. He'd spent the morning greeting fellow servicemen and women, accepting their condolences with quiet dignity while keeping a watchful eye on his mother. Catherine Washington had insisted on greeting every guest personally, despite her arthritis making each handshake painful. "Your father would have wanted me to stand tall today," she'd told Marcus when he suggested she rest. Only when the procession began toward the burial site did she finally acquiesce to using the wheelchair. As the funeral procession arrived at Lakeside Memorial Gardens, General Washington had been focused solely on his mother. Catherine Washington's arthritis made movement difficult, especially on the uneven ground of the cemetery. Marcus had helped her from the car into her wheelchair, his strong hands gentle as he settled her comfortably, adjusting a small cushion behind her back. "Is that better, Mom?" he'd asked, his voice soft despite its deep timbre. Catherine had nodded, patting his hand. "Thank you, Marcus. Your father would be so proud of the man you've become." The general had straightened, momentarily overcome with emotion, before nodding once and turning back to the car. "Let me just make sure the brake is set," he'd said. "This driveway has quite a slope." He'd leaned into the car to adjust the parking brake, his military dress uniform stretching across broad shoulders as he reached for the lever. It was this simple, mundane act that caught Officer Keller's attention as he drove past the cemetery. "We got a call about a suspicious person checking car doors in the cemetery parking lot," Officer Keller would later claim in his report, the words crisp and official on the page, belying the truth behind them. Caller described a large black male in dark clothing, but no such call had been logged by dispatch. No record existed of any complaint. No witnesses reported seeing anyone suspicious except for Officer Keller himself, who had been driving past the cemetery when he noticed General Washington leaning into the car to adjust the brake. What the patrol car's dashboard camera would later reveal was Keller making a sudden U-turn upon seeing Washington, his partner Rodriguez, startled by the abrupt maneuver. "What are you doing?" Rodriguez could be heard asking on the recording. "Look at that," Keller had responded, nodding toward the general. "Guys checking car doors in a cemetery. Probably looking for purses left behind during the service." Rodriguez had frowned, squinting through the windshield. "He's in a suit, Ray. Looks like he's part of the funeral." But Keller was already pulling into the cemetery drive, his mind made up before he had any facts. "These people are getting bolder every day," he'd muttered, too low for the dash cam to pick up clearly. But Rodriguez would later testify to the words and to the implicit meaning behind them. Officer Keller was 41, with 16 years on the Lakeside Police Force. His personnel file, which would later become public record during his trial, told its own damning story. 7 civilian complaints for excessive force, all involving people of color. 2 suspensions for unprofessional conduct. 1 citation for escalating a nonviolent situation, all buried under a system that protected its own. The son of a factory worker and a school secretary, Raymond Keller had grown up in Lakeside's working-class East Side. He'd been an average student, a decent but not outstanding football player, and had joined the police force after a brief, unremarkable stint in community college. His academy instructors had noted his decisive nature and command presence, qualities that had initially seemed like assets but would later reveal themselves as dangerous inflexibility and arrogance. His marriage had ended 3 years earlier, his ex-wife citing his increasingly hostile worldview in their divorce filings. Colleagues had noticed him growing more bitter, more vocal about his resentments, particularly toward the changing demographics of Lakeside. What had once been private grumblings had become increasingly public comments, yet nothing in the department culture had flagged this as concerning. His partner that day, Officer James Rodriguez, was newer to the force, just 3 years in uniform. The son of Mexican immigrants, Rodriguez had joined the police with idealistic notions of community service and bridge building. He'd been paired with Keller for seasoning, as the captain put it, though several fellow officers had privately questioned the wisdom of the partnership. Rodriguez would later testify that Keller had made a comment when they first spotted Washington at the car. "These people always think they can take whatever they want." The younger officer had felt his stomach tighten at the words, at the dismissive tone, but had said nothing, a silence he would later agonize over during countless sleepless nights. "I should have spoken up," he would tell the court, his voice heavy with regret. "I knew what he meant by 'these people.' I knew, and I stayed quiet." Rodriguez had assumed they were simply going to question the man. Standard procedure would have been to observe first, approach with caution, and ask for identification. Instead, Keller had immediately exited the patrol car, unholstered his weapon, and shouted commands before even identifying himself as police. The morning sun had caught the barrel of Keller's gun as he advanced on the general, the metal gleaming ominously in the cemetery's peaceful setting. Birds continued to sing in the nearby oak trees, creating a surreal soundtrack to the unfolding tragedy. Now, with his gun trained on a 4-star general attending his father's funeral, Keller's years of unchecked prejudice and authority had culminated in a moment from which there would be no return. "I'm going to reach for my identification," General Washington said calmly, his eyes never leaving Keller's. "I'm moving my right hand slowly toward my inside pocket." The general's voice carried across the cemetery, steady and controlled. It was the same voice that had commanded troops in combat zones, that had briefed presidents and world leaders, that had maintained order in chaos. Now it served him in a different battlefield, one he had never expected to encounter at his father's funeral. "Don't move," Keller barked, taking a step closer, his feet spread in a shooter's stance, the barrel of his gun unwavering. "Hands where I can see them." From the gathered mourners, a woman's voice rang out. "He's a general in the United States Army. He's the deceased's son." The speaker was Dr. Elaine Jefferson, a longtime family friend and the Washingtons' former neighbor. Her outrage was palpable, her normally composed demeanor cracking under the weight of the injustice unfolding before her. Keller didn't turn, didn't acknowledge. His tunnel vision had narrowed to the man before him, a man whose composure somehow enraged him further. Something in Washington's dignity, in his refusal to cower, fed the officer's anger like oxygen to a flame. "On your knees! Now!" Behind him, Rodriguez shifted uncomfortably, his hand now resting on his own holstered weapon, though whether in preparation to draw it or to prevent himself from doing so wasn't clear. "Ray," he said again, his voice slightly louder. "Ray, we should verify his ID. There's a whole funeral going on here." Keller ignored his partner, his focus absolute. Sweat now ran freely down his temples despite the cool spring air, his breathing increasingly labored. Later, psychologists would discuss the physiological responses at play, the tunnel vision, the auditory exclusion, the loss of rational thought as adrenaline flooded his system. But in that moment, there was only his finger on the trigger and the man who refused to submit. General Washington remained standing. "Officer, I will not kneel at my father's funeral." His words were quiet, but carried an undeniable weight. "I've identified myself verbally. I'm attempting to show you identification. There are dozens of witnesses here who can verify my identity." 20 feet away, Catherine Washington watched in horror from her wheelchair as a police officer pointed a gun at her only son. Her hand gripped the arm of her nephew who stood beside her, Marcus Jr., a software engineer who had flown in from Seattle for the funeral. His own phone was already recording the encounter, his hand trembling with barely contained fury. "Mom, it's going to be okay," General Washington called out, his voice steady despite the weapon aimed at his chest. "Please stay calm." Those words, that concern for his mother even as he faced a loaded gun, would later be cited by the prosecutor as evidence of the general's exceptional character in the face of unthinkable provocation. The video of this moment would be played and replayed in the courtroom, on news programs and police training seminars for years to come, a stark illustration of dignity under duress. Catherine Washington's face was a study in controlled anguish. At 83, she had lived through segregation, through the civil rights movement, through decades of subtle and not-so-subtle racism. She had raised her son to navigate a world that would judge him first by his skin color, had taught him the careful calculations Black Americans make daily for their safety. Now, on the day she buried her husband, she watched all those lessons, all those careful navigations, fail to protect him. Officer Rodriguez finally found his voice. "Ray, we should call this in. Verify his identity." Keller's shoulders tensed further. "He was tampering with vehicles," he insisted, though his voice had lost some of its certainty. The first seeds of doubt were beginning to penetrate his adrenaline-soaked consciousness, aided by his partner's persistent interventions. "I was adjusting my mother's parking brake," General Washington explained, his patience remarkable under the circumstances. "That's her car. This is her husband's, my father's, funeral." He gestured slightly with his head toward the open gravesite visible just beyond the gathered mourners, the polished mahogany casket suspended above it, draped with an American flag. The military honor guard stood at attention nearby, their ceremonial duties interrupted by the confrontation. A murmur went through the crowd. Someone stepped forward, Colonel James Mitchell, in full-dress uniform, a longtime colleague of the general. Mitchell was a white man in his late 50s, his chest heavy with medals that spoke to his own distinguished service. He moved with deliberate slowness, hands visible at his sides, aware of the volatility of the situation. "Officer, I can vouch for General Washington's identity. I've served with him for 20 years. Mitchell's voice was clipped, professional, but underlying it was a current of barely contained outrage. "We're here to bury Sergeant Major Washington with full military honors. What you're doing is not only a mistake, it's a disgrace to the uniform you wear and the one he served in." Keller's eyes flickered for a moment, doubt creeping in. The presence of another high-ranking military officer, the growing number of phones recording the incident, his partner's obvious discomfort, all were beginning to penetrate his tunnel vision. But pride and fear kept his weapon raised. "I'm following procedure," he said, though his voice had lost its earlier conviction. "Until I can verify his identity." "There are 30 witnesses here who can verify his identity," Mitchell cut in, his patience visibly fraying, "including 3 full colonels and a brigadier general. Are you suggesting we're all lying?" What happened next would be viewed millions of times on social media, would be discussed in ethics classes and police academies, would become a defining moment in the national conversation about policing and race. Catherine Washington, with a strength that belied her fragile appearance, pushed herself up from her wheelchair. Leaning heavily on her nephew's arm, she shuffled forward 3 painful steps. "You put that gun down," she commanded, her voice thin but resolute. The voice of a woman who had raised a son to be a general, who had stood by a husband through war and peace, who had lived 8 decades navigating a country that had not always welcomed her. "That is my son. We are burying my husband." How dare you bring more grief to this day? The collective intake of breath from the mourners was audible. An 83-year-old widow confronting an armed officer to protect her son, a son who, ironically, had spent his life protecting the very country this officer was sworn to serve. Catherine Washington stood as straight as her arthritis would allow, her 5'2" frame somehow imposing despite her physical frailty. Her eyes, red-rimmed from crying but clear with purpose, fixed on Keller with an intensity that seemed to physically push against him. "My husband served this country for 30 years," she continued, her voice gaining strength. "He fought in Korea when parts of this country still wouldn't let him drink from the same water fountain as a white man. Our son has given his life to protecting people like you, and this is how you repay that service? With a gun at his chest on the day we lay his father to rest?" For a teetering moment, it seemed Keller might escalate further, his face flushed, his knuckles white around the grip of his weapon. The tension in the cemetery was unbearable, the collective held breath of dozens of witnesses creating a vacuum of anticipation. Some mourners had moved protectively toward Catherine, while others had their phones raised, documenting every second of the confrontation. But then, breaking the tension like a thunderclap, came the voice of authority from behind him. "Officer Keller, lower your weapon immediately. That's an order." Police Chief David Harlow had arrived, alerted by multiple 911 calls from funeral attendees. He moved swiftly, positioning himself between Keller and the general, his own weapon holstered but his hand resting on it. Chief Harlow was a 25-year veteran of the force, a man known for his by-the-book approach and uncompromising standards. "Weapon down now," Harlow commanded, his voice leaving no room for disobedience. Keller's arm wavered, then slowly lowered. The danger passed in an instant, but the damage was irreversible. The relief that washed through the crowd was palpable, releasing in a collective exhale that seemed to rustle the nearby oak trees. "Sir!" Chief Harlow turned to General Washington, his voice heavy with shame. "I cannot begin to express—" "My mother needs to sit down," the general interrupted, already moving toward Catherine. "And we have a funeral to complete. My father deserves that dignity." There was no accusation in his voice, no visible anger, only a steady determination to return the focus to where it belonged, honoring his father. This response, this prioritizing of his mother's comfort and his father's memory over his own justifiable outrage, would later be noted repeatedly during Keller's trial as evidence of the general's exceptional character. Chief Harlow nodded, visibly swallowing whatever apology he'd been about to offer. "Of course, General. Officers Rodriguez and Keller will be leaving immediately." He turned to his subordinates, his expression hardening. "Outside now. Turn in your weapon, Officer Keller." As General Washington guided his mother back to her wheelchair, his arms steady around her shoulders, Chief Harlow turned to Keller, his voice low but cutting. "Outside. Now. Turn in your weapon." Keller stood frozen for a moment, the reality of the situation finally breaking through his adrenaline-fueled haze. His hand trembled slightly as he holstered his weapon, his face ashen as the consequences of his actions began to dawn on him. The crowd of mourners parted as Keller and Rodriguez were escorted from the cemetery. Many had their phones out, recording everything. Among them was journalist Sophia Chen from the Lakeside Gazette, who had been covering the funeral of the locally renowned veteran. Her live updates were already being picked up by national news outlets. Sophia Chen, a meticulous reporter known for her in-depth coverage of local issues, had been taking notes on the notable attendees when the confrontation began. Her journalistic instincts had immediately kicked in, and she'd started a live tweet thread that was gaining traction with each update. Her fingers flew over her phone as she documented the resolution of the standoff. "Chief Harlow has arrived and ordered Officer Keller to stand down. Weapon has been lowered. General Washington is now attending to his mother, showing remarkable composure after having a gun pointed at him at his own father's funeral." Lakeside Funeral. Police misconduct. Within an hour, the first video clips had hit social media. The footage, shot from multiple angles, told a story no written account could fully capture. The casual racism that led an officer to draw his weapon without cause, The dignity of a man who refused to kneel at his father's funeral despite the threat to his life. The courage of an elderly woman rising from her wheelchair to defend her son. By that evening, the footage would be playing on every major news network across the country. Officer Raymond Keller's name and face would become synonymous with police overreach and racial profiling. Hashtags would trend. General at gunpoint. Funeral while black. Keller must go. And the quiet funeral of Sergeant Major William Washington would become the spark that ignited a firestorm of accountability. But for now, as General Marcus Washington returned to the graveside, the focus shifted back to where it belonged. The military honor guard resumed their positions. The chaplain stepped forward to continue the interrupted service. Catherine Washington sat in her wheelchair, her son's hand clasped tightly in her own, her eyes fixed on the flag-draped casket of her husband. The ceremony proceeded with military precision. The chaplain's words spoke of service, of sacrifice, of a life well lived. The honor guard folded the flag with practiced movements, each crease precise, each movement reverent. The bugler played taps, the mournful notes floating through the cemetery, bringing tears to even the most composed faces. General Washington accepted the folded flag with steady hands, then knelt beside his mother's wheelchair to place it gently in her lap. "From a grateful nation," he said softly, repeating the words just spoken to him by the honor guard commander. Catherine's hands trembled as they rested atop the triangular package, her wedding ring glinting in the sunlight. After the final prayers, after the last respects had been paid, General Washington stepped forward to deliver the eulogy he had prepared, the words almost lost to the chaos of the earlier confrontation. He stood tall at the head of the grave, his bearing straight, his voice clear despite the emotion of the day and the trauma of the preceding hour. "My father, Sergeant Major William Washington, understood duty in a way few people ever will," he began. "He understood that true service isn't about recognition or reward. It's about doing what's right, especially when it's difficult, especially when others don't." The gathered mourners listened in silence, many still shaken by the earlier events, all moved by the general's composure in their aftermath. "He enlisted at a time when the country he served didn't always serve him in return," Washington continued. "He faced discrimination both in and out of uniform, but he never wavered in his belief that America could live up to its promises, that the Constitution he swore to defend could one day truly protect all citizens equally." Washington paused, his gaze sweeping over the assembled crowd, lingering briefly on the spot where Keller had stood with his weapon drawn. The irony of the moment, delivering a eulogy about his father's faith in American ideals just minutes after those ideals had failed him so publicly, was lost on no one. "My father taught me that our uniform, whether military or law enforcement, is not what gives us authority. It's our integrity, our restraint, our commitment to justice over power. He believed in an America where no one stands above the law and no one stands beneath dignity." Those words, spoken in the immediate aftermath of having a gun pointed at his chest, carried a weight that left many in tears. They would later be quoted in courtrooms and classrooms alike, a testament to the character of both the man who spoke them and the father who had instilled such principles. As the service concluded, as the mourners began to disperse, General Washington remained by his mother's side, accepting condolences with grace, thanking people for coming, maintaining the dignity of the occasion despite the shadow that had fallen over it. What happened next would test those very principles. As the Washington family laid their patriarch to rest, the wheels of justice had already begun to turn. And for Officer Raymond Keller, there would be no escape from the consequences of his actions. Have you ever witnessed an abuse of power that left you speechless? Comment number 1. If you believe people in positions of authority should be held to higher standards, not lower ones. Or comment number 2 if you've seen someone stand with dignity in the face of unjust treatment, like General Washington did that day. Don't forget to subscribe if you want to see more stories of justice being served against those who abuse their power. What do you think will happen to Officer Keller? Will the system protect him as it has so many times before? Or will this time be different? Let's find out. The videos spread like wildfire. Within hours of the confrontation, Darn General at gunpoint was trending nationwide. The footage, captured from multiple angles by shocked mourners, painted an undeniable picture. A police officer with his weapon drawn on a decorated military leader in full uniform at a veteran's funeral, while the officer ignored clear evidence and multiple witnesses verifying the general's identity. One clip in particular, filmed by Catherine Washington's nephew, Marcus Jr., captured the raw emotional impact. It showed the moment from Catherine's perspective, her son standing tall with a gun pointed at his chest, then her own painful journey forward to confront the officer. Her words, "How dare you bring more grief to this day," became a rallying cry shared millions of times. The video had a visceral quality that transcended political divides. It wasn't just about police misconduct or racial profiling, though those elements were unmistakable. It was about a mother's courage, a son's dignity, a family's grief compounded by injustice. It touched something primal in viewers, the universal understanding of a funeral's sanctity, the natural reverence for a mother's love, the instinctive recognition of unwarranted aggression. Marcus Jr.'s hands had been shaking as he recorded, his breathing audible on the video, punctuated by muttered prayers and half-formed pleas. "Don't shoot him," he could be heard whispering at one point. "Please God, don't let them shoot him at Dad's funeral." The raw fear in his voice, contrasted with his uncle's calm dignity, created a narrative more powerful than any written editorial. Social media exploded with outrage. Military veterans shared their own stories of racial profiling. Police reform advocates pointed to the incident as a textbook example of bias in action. Even typically conservative, pro-police commentators found themselves unable to defend Keller's actions. "This isn't about politics," declared retired Sheriff Michael Donnelly, a frequent Fox News contributor in a viral post. "This is about basic human decency and professional conduct. No officer with proper training and sound judgment draws a weapon in that situation. Period." National news crews descended on Lakeside, a town of just 47,000 that had never seen such attention. Satellite trucks lined the main street. Reporters stationed themselves outside the police station, the Washington family home, and City Hall. Local residents found themselves thrust into impromptu interviews as they went about their daily business. "I've known Ray Keller for 15 years, said Frank Mercer, owner of the downtown hardware store, to a CNN reporter. "Never thought he was a bad cop, but what he did at that funeral, can't defend that, just can't." Outside the police station, protesters gathered, their numbers growing by the hour. What began as a small group of local activists swelled to hundreds as people drove in from neighboring counties, then neighboring states. Signs read, "Protect those who protect us," and "No one is safe when racism wears a badge." Chants of "Justice for Washington" echoed through Lakeside's normally quiet streets. The crowd was diverse, young and old, black and white, veterans in partial uniform standing alongside college students with megaphones. They maintained a peaceful presence, but their message was unambiguous. This time there must be consequences. Inside the station, Chief David Harlow sat across from Officer Raymond Keller in a small conference room. Between them lay Keller's badge and gun, surrendered upon their return from the cemetery. The fluorescent lights cast harsh shadows, emphasizing the lines of strain on both men's faces. 16 years, Harlow said, his voice heavy with disappointment. 16 years on the force, Ray. Did none of that training sink in? Keller's face was flushed, his posture defensive. He sat with his arms crossed tightly over his chest, his jaw clenched. "I was responding to suspicious activity. There was no call." Harlow cut him off, slapping his hand on the table. "Dispatch confirmed. No report of suspicious activity at the cemetery." You saw a black man at a car and made an assumption. The chief's normally controlled demeanor was cracking, his professional detachment strained by the magnitude of what had happened and what was still unfolding outside the station walls. He'd spent the past hour on the phone with the mayor, with the district attorney, with the FBI. The situation was escalating beyond anything Lakeside had ever experienced. He matched the description of, "What description, Ray? There wasn't one." Harlow leaned forward, his voice lowering to a dangerous intensity. "And even if there had been, your response was completely out of proportion. You drew your weapon on a man with no visible threat, no furtive movements, nothing but the color of his skin to justify your suspicion." Keller's gaze dropped to the table, his bluster faltering in the face of his superior's controlled anger. For a brief moment, vulnerability showed through the cracks in his defensive armor, the first glimpse of a man beginning to realize the magnitude of his mistake. Rodriguez, who had been sitting quietly in the corner, spoke up. "Chief, I tried to tell him who it was. Once I saw the uniform, the stars, yet you didn't intervene," Harlow noted, turning his attention to the younger officer. "You didn't step in when your partner escalated a non-situation into a potentially deadly confrontation." Rodriguez looked down, shame evident in his posture. His hands fidgeted in his lap, his shoulders hunched as if under a physical weight. "No, sir, I didn't. I should have been more forceful, should have—" His voice broke, and he cleared his throat before continuing. "There's no excuse, sir." Harlow studied him for a moment, measuring the genuine remorse against the failure of action. Rodriguez was young, still finding his footing as an officer, but that didn't erase his responsibility in what had happened. The chief made a mental note to address the partner's culpability later. For now, Keller was the primary concern. Keller's attorney, Martin Green, a longtime police union lawyer known for getting officers cleared in misconduct cases, leaned forward. Green was a sharp-featured man in his 50s, with thinning hair and expensive cufflinks that caught the fluorescent light as he gestured. "My client was performing his duties as he understood them. This is at most a training issue, perhaps a suspension." "This is way beyond a suspension, counselor," Harlow interrupted, his patience visibly at an end. "I've already spoken with the mayor and the DA. Officer Keller is being placed on administrative leave without pay, effective immediately, pending a criminal investigation." Keller's head snapped up, his eyes widening. "Criminal? Chief, you can't be serious." "Deadly serious," Harlow replied, his gaze unflinching. "Aggravated assault at minimum, potentially civil rights violations. The FBI has already called." "The FBI?" Keller's voice cracked, the color draining from his face. "For doing my job?" Harlow leaned forward, his patience visibly thinning. "Your job was never to point a loaded weapon at an unarmed citizen who posed no threat. Your job was never to ignore multiple credible witnesses. Your job was never to traumatize a grieving family burying a veteran who served this country with honor." He stood up, gathering the badge and weapon from the table with a deliberate movement. The badge, Shield number 437, had been Keller's identity for 16 years. Now it sat in the chief's palm, its significance suddenly reduced to a piece of metal. The Washington family deserved better from us today. This department deserved better. This badge deserved better. As Harlow left the room, the reality of the situation began to sink in for Keller. His face, once flushed with defiance, drained of color. For the first time in his 16-year career, he was facing real consequences. Not a written reprimand to be filed away and forgotten, not a brief suspension with pay, but potential criminal charges, national scrutiny, and the end of the career that had defined his adult life. "They can't do this," he said to Green, his voice barely above a whisper. "There must be something you can do." Green's expression was grim as he gathered his papers. "I'll do what I can, Ray, but this isn't like your other incidents. This was a 4-star general at his father's funeral with dozens of witnesses and multiple videos. The optics couldn't be worse." "Optics?" Keller repeated, his voice rising. "This isn't about optics. This is my career, my life." Green sighed. closing his briefcase with a definitive click. In cases like this, Ray, optics become reality. And the reality is that you pulled a gun on one of the highest-ranking military officers in the country while he was burying his father. That footage isn't going away. As Green and Keller continued their tense discussion, Rodriguez sat silently, wrestling with his own culpability. He had been raised to respect authority, to trust the system, to believe in the brotherhood of the badge. But today those beliefs had collided with his own moral compass, and he had found himself paralyzed in the moment of choice. Now, as he watched his partner's career imploding, he faced his own reckoning. Across town, at the Washington family home, a different kind of meeting was taking place. General Marcus Washington sat in his childhood living room, surrounded by family, close friends, and 3 senior military officials who had flown in immediately upon hearing of the incident. The Washington home was modest but impeccably maintained, a 2-story colonial on Maple Street that William and Catherine had purchased in 1965, one of the first black families in that neighborhood. Family photos lined the walls, William in his dress uniform from various eras, Marcus as a West Point cadet, Catherine receiving a Community Service Award. A shadow box displaying William's medals hung prominently near the fireplace, a testament to his service. "Marcus, the president himself called me," said General Eleanor Thomas, Army Chief of Staff and a longtime mentor to Washington. She was a formidable presence, the first woman to hold her position, her uniform adorned with the insignia of her rank. "He's offered any resources you need. Legal, security, whatever you require." Thomas had been in Washington, D.C. when the first videos hit social media. She'd immediately recognized the implications, not just for Marcus personally, but for the military, for race relations, for the country's already strained conversation about policing. She'd boarded a military transport within the hour, bringing with her Lieutenant General David Chen and Major General Alicia Rodriguez, colleagues who had served with Washington and considered him not just a fellow officer but a friend. General Washington nodded, his expression somber. He had changed from his dress uniform into civilian clothes, a simple button-down shirt and slacks, but his military bearing remained evident in his posture, in the measured precision of his movements. "I appreciate that. But this isn't about me. It's about my mother, who had to stand from her wheelchair to defend her son at her husband's funeral. It's about every person who lives in fear that a routine traffic stop or a walk in their own neighborhood might be the end of their story." Catherine Washington sat nearby, outwardly composed but with hands that trembled slightly as she held a cup of tea. A lifetime of being a military wife had taught her strength, but today had tested the limits of even her formidable resilience. Her nephew, Marcus Jr., sat beside her, occasionally reaching over to steady her cup when the trembling became more pronounced. "The footage is everywhere, Uncle Marcus," Marcus Jr. said, his voice tight with controlled anger. "My video alone has over 2 million views already. People are demanding justice." Washington nodded, acknowledging the information without commenting on it. His own phone had been buzzing continuously with notifications, calls, and messages since they'd returned from the cemetery. He'd silenced it upon entering the house, prioritizing his mother's well-being over the growing national reaction. Lieutenant General Chen, who had worked with Washington on strategic planning for over a decade, leaned forward. "Marcus, you need to consider your response carefully. This incident has implications beyond Lakeside. How you handle it will set a tone for discussions about race, authority, and accountability across the country." Chen's analytical mind was already processing the various dimensions of the incident, the legal aspects, the media narrative, the potential for both positive change and dangerous polarization. As an Asian American who had faced his own battles with prejudice within the military hierarchy, he understood the personal toll as well as the public implications. "David's right," Major General Rodriguez added. "You have an opportunity here to channel the outrage into something constructive, but it needs to be on your terms, not dictated by the news cycle or social media momentum. Rodriguez had served under Washington in Iraq, had seen his leadership under fire, his ability to make clear decisions in chaotic situations. She respected him not just as a superior officer, but as a man whose moral compass remained steady regardless of circumstance. Today, she saw that same steady resolve, even as he processed his own trauma. "What do you want to do, son?" Catherine asked quietly, her voice bringing the room to attentive silence. Despite her physical fragility, her presence commanded respect. A matriarch who had raised a general, who had supported a career soldier through decades of service, who understood duty and sacrifice in ways few civilians ever could. General Washington looked at her, his decision already made. "I want justice, Mom. Not vengeance, not special treatment because of my rank, just the same justice Dad believed in, the same justice this country promises to all its citizens." Catherine nodded, a small, sad smile touching her lips. "Your father would be proud." The room fell silent for a moment, each person present understanding the weight of the decision. Washington wasn't just choosing a legal path forward, he was defining how this incident would be framed in the public consciousness, how it would be remembered in history. A soft knock at the door interrupted them. Marcus Jr. answered it to find Sophia Chen, the journalist whose live coverage had helped bring national attention to the incident. Chen stood on the porch, notebook in hand, her press credentials displayed prominently. She was in her early 30s, with keen eyes that missed nothing and a reputation for fair but uncompromising reporting. "I apologize for intruding on your family's time," she said, "but I wanted to speak with the general directly rather than relying on statements from officials." Marcus Jr. looked back at his uncle, silently seeking direction. Washington nodded once, and his nephew stepped aside to allow the journalist entry. "General Washington," she said, stepping into the room after being invited, "I know this is a difficult time, but people need to hear your perspective. Your voice matters in this conversation." The general considered for a moment, then nodded. "I'll speak, Ms. Chen, not to inflame tensions, but to call for accountability. The same accountability I've demanded of myself and those under my command throughout my career." Chen nodded, understanding the significance of what she was being offered. Washington wasn't a man who sought the spotlight or gave interviews readily. His willingness to speak now reflected his understanding of the moment's importance. The interview that followed was a masterclass in dignified restraint. General Washington never raised his voice, never called for retribution against Officer Keller. Instead, he spoke of systemic issues, of the need for better training, and of his faith that justice would prevail. "I've spent my life defending American values," he told Chen, his words measured and deliberate. "Among those is the belief that no one is above the law. Officer Keller made choices today that violated his oath and endangered lives. I believe our justice system must address those choices appropriately." When asked how the incident had affected him personally, Washington paused, considering his answer carefully. "Today was meant to be about honoring my father's memory, about supporting my mother through her grief. Instead, it became about something else entirely. That is perhaps the most painful aspect, the disruption of what should have been a sacred time for our family." Chen nodded, making notes. "And your mother? How is she coping with all of this?" Washington glanced at Catherine, who sat straight-backed in her chair, listening to the interview with sharp attention. "My mother is the strongest person I know," he said simply. "She has faced challenges throughout her life with grace and courage. Today was no exception." When asked about forgiveness, the general paused thoughtfully. "Forgiveness isn't the absence of consequences," he finally said. "It's the absence of vengeance. I don't seek the latter, but I do believe in the former." As the interview concluded, Chen asked one final question. "General Washington, what would you say to Officer Keller if he were sitting across from you right now?" The general's response would later be quoted in the courtroom. "I would ask him to examine the fear that led him to see a threat in a son burying his father. And I would tell him that the uniform, whether it carries a badge or stars, is meant to elevate our humanity, not diminish it. Chen thanked him for his time, shook his hand, and left with what she knew was a powerful exclusive. Within hours, her article would be published online, then picked up by national outlets, its measured tone and direct quotes from Washington providing a counterpoint to the raw emotion of the viral videos. As the journalist departed, General Thomas approached Washington. "That was well handled, Marcus. Dignified, measured, but uncompromising on the principle at stake." Washington nodded, but his attention had already returned to his mother, who looked increasingly fatigued as the emotional day took its toll. "I think we need to end this day, Mom. You should rest." Catherine nodded, allowing her son to help her to her feet. "It's been a long day," she agreed, her voice thin with exhaustion. "But William would be proud of how you've conducted yourself, Marcus. Not just today, but every day." As the Washington family prepared for a night of rest after the most difficult day of their lives, across town, Officer Raymond Keller was beginning to understand that his life would never be the same again. The bubble of protection that had surrounded him throughout his career had finally burst, and the reckoning that awaited him would be played out on a national stage. The days that followed brought revelations that would change the trajectory of the case against Officer Keller. Journalist Sophia Chen, digging into Keller's history, uncovered a pattern that could no longer be ignored. Working from a cramped desk in the Lakeside Gazette's modest offices, Chen methodically built a case file on Keller that no one had bothered to assemble before. She pulled public records, interviewed former complainants, and built a timeline of incidents that, viewed individually, might seem isolated but together formed a damning pattern. Working with civil rights attorneys, Chen obtained records of complaints against Keller that had been buried or dismissed, 7 official complaints of excessive force against people of color, 3 additional incidents that never made it to formal complaints because the victims were too afraid to pursue them. "It wasn't just one bad day," said Thomas Jefferson, a 19-year-old college student who had filed a complaint 3 years earlier after Keller had slammed him against a wall during a routine traffic stop. "This man has been terrorizing people who look like me for years, but nobody listened until he pulled a gun on someone with stars on his shoulders." Jefferson's complaint had been dismissed for insufficient evidence, despite a witness corroborating his account. Now, he sat across from Chen in a coffee shop, sharing his story publicly for the first time. "I'm not happy about what happened to General Washington," he said, "but I'm glad people are finally seeing who Keller really is." Most damning was the testimony of former Officer Teresa Mendez, who had left the force 2 years earlier. A 10-year veteran who had briefly partnered with Keller, Mendez had resigned after her concerns about his conduct were repeatedly ignored. She came forward with text messages from Keller that contained explicitly racist language, including derogatory terms used to describe black residents of Lakeside. "I couldn't stay on a force that protected him," Mendez told Chen in an exclusive interview, her hands clasped tightly on the table between them, her expression a mixture of relief and residual fear. "Every time someone filed a complaint, it disappeared. Every time he escalated a situation unnecessarily with a person of color, it was explained away. The system didn't just fail to stop him, it enabled him." Mendez described departmental practices that shielded officers like Keller, complaints routed to sympathetic supervisors, body camera footage accidentally deleted, victims intimidated or discredited. "It wasn't everyone," she clarified. "Most officers are good people trying to do right by the community. But there was a culture of protection around certain officers, and Keller was one of them." Chen's expose, published as a 4-part series in the Gazette and quickly picked up by national media, created a secondary wave of outrage beyond the initial incident at the funeral. It raised questions not just about one officer's actions, but about systemic failures within the Lakeside Police Department, failures that had allowed a pattern of misconduct to continue unchecked for years. Meanwhile, Officer Rodriguez, facing his own potential charges as Keller's partner who failed to intervene, made a decision that would seal Keller's fate. After 3 sleepless nights, after conversations with his parents, his priest, and finally an attorney, he agreed to cooperate fully with investigators. In exchange for leniency, he agreed to testify about what really happened that day and about other incidents he had witnessed during his 3 years working with Keller. He made a comment when we first saw General Washington, Rodriguez revealed during a recorded interview with internal affairs investigators. These people always think they can take whatever they want. He said it before we even got out of the car. There was never any call about suspicious activity. He profiled the general based solely on race, then invented a justification after the fact. Rodriguez spoke for hours, his initial hesitation giving way to what seemed like relief as he unburdened himself of what he had witnessed. He described other incidents. Keller conducting warrantless searches in predominantly minority neighborhoods, using excessive force during arrests of Black and Hispanic suspects, making racially charged comments during patrols. "I should have reported it sooner," Rodriguez admitted, his voice heavy with regret. "I told myself I was new, that I needed to learn the ropes, that speaking up would end my career before it began. But after what happened at that funeral, I can't be silent anymore." This testimony, combined with the video evidence and Keller's documented history, led the district attorney to upgrade the charges. Raymond Keller would not face simple assault or misconduct charges. He would be prosecuted for aggravated assault with a deadly weapon, intimidation based on race, deprivation of civil rights under color of law, and filing false police reports. If convicted on all counts, he could face up to 25 years in prison. The announcement sent shockwaves through the law enforcement community. The police union, which had initially stood firmly behind Keller, began to distance itself as the evidence mounted. A statement from Union President Michael Barnes expressed concern about the severity of the charges, but notably lacked any strong defense of Keller himself. Individual officers were divided. Some maintained that Keller was being made a scapegoat, that the pressures of the job and split-second decisions were being judged unfairly in hindsight. Others, particularly younger officers and officers of color, expressed relief that accountability seemed to be taking hold. "We can't police effectively without community trust," said Officer Letitia Johnson, an 8-year veteran of the force. "And we can't have community trust if officers who abuse their power aren't held accountable. It's that simple." Chief Harlow, in a press conference that drew national attention, made the department's position clear. Officer Keller's actions do not represent the values of this department or the oath we all took to protect and serve. We are cooperating fully with all investigations and are committed to ensuring that justice is served, regardless of which side of the badge the perpetrator stands on. Harlow looked haggard as he spoke, the strain of the past week evident in the new lines on his face and the shadows under his eyes. But his voice was firm, his gaze direct as he addressed not just the assembled press but the community watching via live stream. "Furthermore," he continued, "we are conducting a comprehensive review of all complaints filed against Officer Keller throughout his tenure, as well as our own procedures for handling such complaints. If systemic failures allowed misconduct to go unaddressed, those failures will be identified and corrected." For General Washington and his family, the escalating case brought unwanted attention during what should have been a private time of mourning. News vans remained stationed near their home. Reporters approached family members for comments. Social media continued to churn with opinions, analyses, and calls for action. Yet the general maintained his dignity, declining most interview requests and focusing instead on supporting his mother through her grief. He issued only brief statements through a military public affairs officer, consistently emphasizing the need to let the justice system work without undue influence from public opinion or political pressure. "My father believed in American institutions," one statement read. "He believed that despite their flaws, they could deliver justice when properly applied. I share that belief. The investigation and legal proceedings should continue without interference, guided by facts rather than emotion. When asked by reporters about the upgraded charges, he offered only a brief statement. The justice system must be allowed to work without interference or pressure. I have faith that it will. That faith would soon be tested as the case moved toward trial, and Officer Raymond Keller faced the full weight of his actions in a courtroom where his badge no longer shielded him from accountability. Have you ever seen someone face consequences they never expected? Comment below if you believe the upgraded charges against Officer Keller were justified, or if you think the system was making an example of him. And don't forget to subscribe for updates on this developing story of justice in action. The courthouse steps were crowded with media, protesters, and curious onlookers on the morning Raymond Keller's trial began. 6 months had passed since the confrontation at Sergeant Major Washington's funeral. 6 months of investigations, motions, and attempted plea deals that the district attorney had firmly rejected. Spring had given way to summer, summer to fall, and now winter's first chill hung in the air as Keller made his way up the courthouse steps, flanked by his attorney and a private security detail hired to protect him from the public's wrath. The once confident officer now moved with the furtive caution of the hunted, his eyes darting nervously across the crowd, his shoulders hunched as if expecting a blow. News cameras tracked his progress, commentators narrating his every movement for viewers across the country. This case had become more than a local incident. It had evolved into a national referendum on policing, on race, on accountability. The people of this county deserved to see this case tried on its merits, District Attorney Elaine Wilson had stated when announcing her decision to proceed to trial, despite multiple attempts by Keller's defense to secure a plea bargain. The evidence speaks for itself. Wilson, a career prosecutor with a reputation for methodical preparation and unshakable composure in the courtroom, had taken personal charge of the case. At 47, she was at the peak of her professional capabilities, with a record of successful prosecutions that had made her both respected and feared in legal circles. As the first black woman to serve as DA in the county's history, she was acutely aware of the historical significance of this case and of the scrutiny her handling of it would receive. Inside the courtroom, the atmosphere was tense. On one side sat Keller, now thinner and grayer than he had appeared in his mugshot months earlier. Gone was the confident swagger of a man accustomed to authority. In its place was the hunched posture of someone facing the potential loss of everything. His attorney, Martin Green, had tried every procedural maneuver available to delay or derail the prosecution. He'd tried to get the venue changed, arguing that his client couldn't receive a fair trial in Lakeside due to media coverage. The motion was denied. He'd tried to suppress the videos, claiming they didn't show the full context. Denied again. He'd tried to exclude Rodriguez's testimony as that of a co-conspirator seeking leniency. The judge had shut him down at every turn. On the prosecution's side sat District Attorney Wilson with her team, their table neat and organized, their confidence evident in their relaxed but attentive postures. Behind them, in the first row of the gallery, sat General Marcus Washington, composed and attentive in a perfectly tailored civilian suit. He had come alone, insisting that his mother not subject herself to the stress of the proceedings. "She's done her part," he had told Catherine when she expressed her intention to attend. "She stood up when it mattered most. Now it's the justice system's turn to stand up." The gallery was filled to capacity, the public seats allocated by lottery due to the overwhelming interest in the case. Among those present were several of Keller's previous victims, including Thomas Jefferson, whose complaint had been dismissed years earlier. They sat together, a visible reminder of the pattern that had led to this moment. Sophia Chen was also present, her press credentials granting her a reserved seat. Her notepad was open, her pen poised to document this next chapter in a story that had launched her from local reporter to nationally recognized journalist. Her series on Keller's history had earned her a Pulitzer nomination and job offers from major news organizations, all of which she had declined, choosing to remain with the Gazette to see this story through to its conclusion. Judge Miriam Okafor, a 20-year veteran of the bench known for her strict adherence to procedure, called the court to order. A formidable presence in her black robes, Judge Okafor had a reputation for running an efficient courtroom and showing zero tolerance for grandstanding or delay tactics. "The state versus Raymond Keller," she announced, her voice carrying clearly through the hushed room. "We will proceed with opening statements." D.A. Wilson approached the jury, her steps measured, her voice clear and strong. "This case is about abuse of power in its most dangerous form," she began, making eye contact with each juror in turn. "It's about what happens when authority is corrupted by prejudice, when a badge becomes not a symbol of protection but a license to intimidate." She walked them through the events methodically: the lack of any reported suspicious activity, Keller's immediate escalation to deadly force, his refusal to accept the word of multiple credible witnesses, the trauma inflicted on a grieving family. "The defense will ask you to believe that Officer Keller was simply doing his job," she continued, her voice taking on a more pointed edge. "But I ask you, when did an officer's job include pointing a loaded weapon at an unarmed, decorated military leader attending his father's funeral? When did it include ignoring multiple witnesses, including fellow military personnel in uniform? When did it include traumatizing an 83-year-old widow on the day she buried her husband of 60 years? She paused, letting the questions hang in the air. The courtroom was silent, every person present held in the grip of her carefully constructed narrative. The evidence will show that Raymond Keller's actions that day weren't about protecting and serving. They were about intimidation and control. And when the person he tried to control turned out to be a 4-star general with witnesses and cameras present, Keller didn't back down. He doubled down, because backing down would mean acknowledging his mistake, acknowledging that he had seen a threat where none existed, solely because of the color of General Washington's skin. Wilson returned to her seat, having laid out a damning framework for the prosecution's case. Keller sat motionless, his eyes fixed on the table before him, as if unable to meet the gaze of the jurors who would decide his fate. Martin Green's opening statement took a different approach. He portrayed Keller as a dedicated officer working in an increasingly dangerous world, making split-second decisions to protect the community. Standing before the jury, Green adopted a conversational tone, seeking to humanize his client and contextualize his actions. "Policing isn't perfect," Green argued, his hands spread in a gesture of candor. "Officers must make judgment calls based on limited information, often in situations where hesitation could be fatal. Yes, Officer Keller was wrong about General Washington, but being wrong isn't a crime." He was responding as his training dictated to what he perceived as suspicious behavior. He emphasized Keller's years of service, the dangers he had faced, the arrests he had made that had kept the community safe. He spoke of media bias, of a rush to judgment, of the pressures faced by law enforcement in an era of heightened scrutiny. But as Green spoke, several jurors glanced toward General Washington, sitting composed and attentive in the gallery. The contrast between the dignified military leader and Green's portrayal of him as someone whose behavior could reasonably be perceived as suspicious was stark. The defense attorney seemed to sense this disconnect, his arguments growing less assured as he concluded his opening statement. The argument fell flat in the face of what came next: the videos. Multiple angles of the same confrontation played for the jury on a large screen at the front of the courtroom. They saw Keller approach with weapon drawn. They heard him dismiss multiple witnesses. They watched Catherine Washington rise from her wheelchair to defend her son. The footage was more powerful than any testimony, any argument, any expert analysis. It showed raw reality: an armed officer threatening an unarmed man at a funeral, ignoring all reason, all protocol, all humanity. Most damaging was the body camera footage from Officer Rodriguez, which captured Keller's comment before they even exited the patrol car. "These people always think they can take whatever they want." The prosecution's first witness was James Rodriguez himself, now resigned from the force and facing his own lesser charges. Under oath, he described not just that day, but a pattern of behavior he had witnessed during his time as Keller's partner. "He had different rules for different people," Rodriguez testified, his voice steady despite the visible discomfort of testifying against a former colleague. Traffic stops in the East Side, which is predominantly Black and Hispanic, always lasted longer, involved more questions, more requests to search vehicles. He'd find reasons to escalate ordinary interactions into confrontations, especially with minorities. "And on the day in question?" D.A. Wilson asked, guiding him back to the central incident. "There was no call about suspicious activity," Rodriguez confirmed, his gaze briefly meeting Keller's before shifting away. He saw General Washington at the car and made an assumption. "When I tried to tell him who the general was, he ignored me. It was like once he decided the general was a criminal, nothing could change his mind, not the uniform, not the witnesses, nothing." Green's cross-examination attempted to paint Rodriguez as a traitor seeking to save himself. "Isn't it true that you're only testifying to avoid serious charges yourself?" he demanded, his tone scathing. "I'm testifying because what happened that day was wrong," Rodriguez replied steadily, refusing to be provoked. "And because I was wrong for not stopping it." The parade of witnesses continued throughout the week. Funeral attendees described their shock at seeing an officer draw his weapon in a cemetery during a service. Colonel James Mitchell testified about identifying himself to Keller and vouching for General Washington, only to be dismissed. "I stated clearly that I could verify General Washington's identity," Mitchell recounted, his military bearing evident even in civilian clothes. "I identified myself as a colonel in the United States Army." Officer Keller's response was, and I quote, "Back off or you're next." I found that response not only unprofessional but indicative of a complete disregard for the situation at hand. Sophia Chen presented her investigative findings, including testimony from former Officer Teresa Mendez about Keller's history of racist comments and the department's pattern of burying complaints against him. "Officer Mendez provided me with text messages from Officer Keller," Chen testified, as the messages in question were displayed on the courtroom screen. In these messages, he refers to Black residents of Lakeside using racial slurs and derogatory language. He specifically mentions, and again I quote, "keeping them in their place when discussing patrols in predominantly Black neighborhoods." The text messages, displayed in stark black and white on the courtroom screen, drew audible reactions from the gallery. Keller slumped further in his seat, unable to deny words written in his own hand. Chief Harlow testified about the department's policies and Keller's history, acknowledging systemic failures while maintaining that Keller's actions had violated clear protocols. "Our use of force policy explicitly states that weapons should only be drawn when there is a reasonable belief of imminent threat," Harlow stated. "There was no such threat in this situation. Furthermore, when multiple witnesses attempted to identify General Washington, proper procedure would have been to verify that information, not dismiss it." But perhaps the most powerful testimony came from Catherine Washington, who insisted on appearing despite her son's concerns. At 83, she made her way slowly to the witness stand, refusing assistance, her dignity intact despite her evident physical discomfort. The courtroom fell silent as she was sworn in, her thin voice nevertheless clear as she promised to tell the truth. She wore a simple navy dress, a strand of pearls her only adornment, her white hair arranged in a neat bun. Despite her physical frailty, she projected a moral authority that commanded respect from everyone present. "Mrs. Washington," D.A. Wilson began gently, "can you tell the court what happened the day of your husband's funeral?" Catherine's voice was soft but clear, carrying to every corner of the hushed courtroom. "I was saying goodbye to my William after 60 years together. Marcus, my son, had helped me from the car to my wheelchair. He went back to check the brake because the driveway slopes. The next thing I knew, there was shouting. I looked up and saw a police officer pointing a gun at my son's chest. She described the scene with simple eloquence, her words painting a vivid picture of a sacred occasion desecrated by unwarranted aggression. As she spoke of her fear, of watching her son face a loaded weapon with the same courage his father had shown in combat, several jurors visibly struggled to maintain their composure. "What did you do?" Wilson prompted. "I did what any mother would do," she said simply, her hands folded neatly in her lap. "I protected my child. Even at my age, even at my husband's funeral, I had to stand up from my wheelchair to tell that officer he was wrong. No mother should have to do that. No American should have to do that." Her words hung in the air, a powerful indictment not just of Keller's actions, but of a reality many Black Americans face daily, the need to protect themselves and their loved ones from those sworn to protect them. Green, sensing the impact of her testimony, kept his cross-examination brief and respectful. But the damage was done. There wasn't a dry eye in the jury box. On the fourth day of trial, General Marcus Washington took the stand. The courtroom fell silent as he was sworn in, his bearing military precise even in civilian clothes, his responses clear and measured. "General Washington," D.A. Wilson began, "could you describe your actions immediately before Officer Keller approached you?" "I had helped my mother from the car to her wheelchair," he explained, his deep voice carrying easily through the courtroom. "Then I returned to make sure the parking brake was properly engaged, as the cemetery driveway has a significant slope. That's when I heard someone shout behind me." "Did Officer Keller identify himself as police?" "Not initially, no. He shouted, 'Get back and don't move.' When I turned, his weapon was already drawn and pointed at me." "What was going through your mind at that moment?" The general paused, considering. "Concern for my mother. Concern for the other mourners, including children, and frankly, concern that any sudden movement on my part might result in this officer discharging his weapon." "Did you feel your life was in danger?" "Yes," he answered simply. Officer Keller's finger was on the trigger. His demeanor was agitated. He dismissed multiple witnesses who verified my identity. In my professional assessment, based on combat experience and training, he represented a clear and present threat. "Yet you remained calm." "I've faced life-threatening situations before. Training takes over. Escalation would have only increased the danger to everyone present." When it was Green's turn to cross-examine, he tried a new angle. "General Washington, isn't it possible that from Officer Keller's perspective, your movements around the vehicle appeared suspicious?" The general's response was measured but firm. An officer's perspective should be informed by observation and facts, not prejudice. The facts were clear. I was in full military dress uniform at a funeral. Multiple witnesses immediately identified me. My mother was present in a wheelchair. There was nothing suspicious about my actions unless Officer Keller began with the assumption that I didn't belong there. Green pressed on. "You've commanded troops in high-stress situations. You know that split-second decisions sometimes need to be made with limited information." "I do," Washington agreed. "And those decisions reveal character. When faced with uncertainty, Officer Keller chose intimidation over investigation. He chose to see a threat where none existed. That's not training, that's bias." As the general stepped down from the witness stand, his eyes briefly met Keller's across the courtroom. It was a moment of stark contrast. One man had faced a loaded gun with dignity and restraint. The other had wielded that gun with prejudice and fear. The symbolism was lost on no one present. The defense case was weak by comparison. Character witnesses for Keller seemed hesitant, their praise qualified. A former supervisor spoke of his dedication to patrol duties, but acknowledged on cross-examination that there had been concerns about his interaction style with certain community members. A police psychologist testified about the stresses of the job, the phenomenon of tunnel vision during perceived threats, the fight-or-flight response that can override rational thought. But under Wilson's skillful cross-examination, she admitted that nothing in the funeral scenario should have triggered such a response in a properly trained officer. If an officer perceives a threat in an elderly woman in a wheelchair and her son in military dress uniform at a funeral, Wilson asked pointedly, wouldn't that perception itself indicate a problem with the officer's judgment? The psychologist hesitated. Context is important in threat assessment, she finally acknowledged. In this context, yes, that perception would be problematic. Keller himself took the stand against his attorney's advice. His testimony was defensive, contradictory, and ultimately damaging to his own case. Gone was the arrogant officer who had drawn his weapon at a funeral. In his place sat a man desperately trying to salvage what remained of his reputation and freedom. When confronted with the body camera footage of his comment about these people, he claimed it was taken out of context. I was referring to car thieves, he insisted, though the timing of the comment, made upon first seeing Washington, undermined this claim. When asked about his dismissal of multiple witnesses, including a colonel in uniform, he insisted he was following protocol. In a potential threat situation, you don't take your eyes off the subject, he said. You don't let bystanders distract you. D.A. Wilson approached the witness stand, her expression incredulous. So you're saying that Colonel Mitchell, in full military dress uniform, was just a bystander whose identification of General Washington was a distraction? Keller shifted uncomfortably. In that moment, yes, anyone could claim to be anything. I had no way to verify. No way to verify, Wilson interrupted, her voice rising slightly. The colonel was in full uniform. General Washington was in full uniform. There was an entire funeral procession with military honors taking place. And you had no way to verify? The cross-examination continued in this vein, with Wilson methodically dismantling each of Keller's explanations, exposing the contradictions in his testimony, the implausibility of his claimed perceptions, the bias underlying his actions. By the time she finished, Keller appeared visibly shaken, his earlier defensiveness replaced by a dawning realization of the inevitability of his conviction. In closing arguments, Green attempted to humanize his client, speaking of Keller's years of service and the split-second nature of police work. But his arguments sounded hollow in the face of the overwhelming evidence presented throughout the trial. The videos, the testimony, the documented pattern of behavior all pointed to a clear conclusion that no amount of legal maneuvering could obscure. This case isn't complicated, she told the jury in her closing statement, her voice carrying the weight of moral certainty. Raymond Keller saw a black man and assumed criminality. When confronted with evidence to the contrary, he refused to adjust his perspective because doing so would require him to acknowledge his bias. Instead, he doubled down, creating risk where none existed, traumatizing a family in mourning, and violating the very oath he swore to uphold. She walked to the evidence table and picked up Keller's badge, which had been entered as an exhibit. Holding it up for the jury to see, the medal catching the courtroom lights, she delivered her final appeal. This is a symbol of trust. Those who wear it must be held to a higher standard, not a lower one. When that trust is violated, especially when it's violated based on prejudice, the consequences must be significant. Not out of vengeance, but out of justice. The kind of justice that ensures no other family has to experience what the Washingtons endured on what was already one of the hardest days of their lives. The jury deliberated for just 4 hours before returning with their verdict, guilty on all counts. As the foreman read out the verdict, Keller's shoulders slumped further with each guilty pronouncement. His attorney placed a steadying hand on his arm, but Keller seemed beyond comfort, his face ashen as the reality of his situation fully dawned on him. In the gallery there was no celebration, no outbursts, only the collective exhalation of a community that had held its breath waiting for accountability. General Washington remained composed, his expression revealing nothing of his inner thoughts, as the man who had pointed a gun at his chest was declared guilty by a jury of his peers. 2 weeks later, at the sentencing hearing, Judge Okafor addressed Keller directly. The courtroom was once again filled to capacity, The nation's attention focused on this final act in a drama that had exposed deep fractures in American society. "Mr. Keller, you abuse the authority entrusted to you by this community," Judge Okafor began, her voice carrying the full weight of judicial authority. "You allowed prejudice to cloud your judgment and endanger lives. Your actions that day and the pattern of behavior established during this trial demonstrate that you should never again be in a position of authority over others." Keller stood before her, diminished in civilian clothes, his posture that of a man already defeated. The confident officer who had drawn his weapon at a funeral was gone, replaced by someone confronting the consequences of actions he had never expected to be held accountable for. "This court has a responsibility not just to punish wrongdoing, but to deter similar conduct by others in positions of authority," Judge Okafor continued. "The sentence I impose today must reflect the gravity of your offense, the abuse of public trust it represents, and the need to send a clear message that such conduct will not be tolerated in a society governed by laws rather than fear." She sentenced him to 22 years in prison, near the maximum allowed. With no possibility of parole for at least 15 years, Raymond Keller would indeed rot in prison for what many considered a life sentence for a man already in his 40s. As Keller was led away in handcuffs, General Washington watched from the gallery, his expression solemn. He had not sought vengeance, but he had insisted on justice. And on this day, in this courtroom, justice had been served. Outside the courthouse, reporters shouted questions, seeking his reaction to the verdict and sentence. The general paused on the steps, considered for a moment, then spoke words that would be quoted in law schools and police academies for years to come. "Today isn't about celebration. It's about accountability. One case doesn't fix a system, but it does send a message that a badge is not a shield from consequences. That power must be paired with responsibility, and that in America, no one should live in fear of those sworn to protect them." He declined further questions, instead walking to where his mother waited in her car. Catherine Washington sat in the passenger seat, her face visible through the window, lined with age and experience, but composed with the same dignity her son consistently displayed. Together they drove to the cemetery, to the quiet grave of Sergeant Major William Washington, where they could finally mourn in peace, their fight for justice complete. The case of Officer Raymond Keller and General Marcus Washington didn't end with the courtroom verdict. Its ripples spread far beyond Lakeside, catalyzing changes that would impact police departments across the country. In the months following Keller's sentencing, a Department of Justice investigation into the Lakeside Police Department uncovered systemic issues that had enabled Keller's behavior for years. The investigation, prompted by the national attention the case had received, went far beyond the single incident at the funeral, examining departmental policies, complaint procedures, disciplinary records, and supervisory practices. What they found was a culture of protection and silence, a system designed to shield officers from accountability rather than to ensure public safety and equal treatment. Complaints were routinely buried, body camera footage went missing when it might incriminate officers, and supervisors looked the other way when confronted with evidence of misconduct, particularly when that misconduct targeted minority communities. 5 senior officers were forced to resign, their complicity in covering up previous incidents exposed by emails, altered reports, and testimony from junior officers who had finally found the courage to speak. These weren't just low-level supervisors. They included a captain, 2 lieutenants, and senior officers in internal affairs, the very people tasked with ensuring departmental integrity. 7 previous cases involving Keller were reopened, resulting in settlements for victims who had been silenced or ignored. These settlements, totaling over $4.2 million, strained the city's budget, but provided some measure of justice for those whose earlier complaints had been dismissed. Thomas Jefferson, the college student whose complaint 3 years earlier had been buried, received not just financial compensation, but a formal apology from the city. The money doesn't erase what happened, he told reporters after the settlement was announced. But the acknowledgement matters. For years, they made me feel like I was crazy for thinking Keller's treatment was wrong. Now there's official recognition that I was right all along. Chief David Harlow, though not implicated in the cover-ups, took early retirement, acknowledging that the failures had happened under his watch. At his final press conference, he appeared older than his years, the strain of the past months evident in the new lines on his face and the weariness in his eyes. "Leadership means responsibility," he said in his final press conference, facing a room filled with reporters and community members. "I failed to see what was happening in my own department, and for that I need to be accountable. The changes Lakeside needs require new leadership, fresh perspectives, and a complete break from past practices." The city of Lakeside implemented sweeping reforms: mandatory body cameras with automatic flagging of incidents where weapons were drawn, civilian oversight boards with actual disciplinary authority, implicit bias training conducted by outside experts rather than internal affairs, and most significantly, a complete overhaul of the complaint system. "Before, complaints went into a black hole," explained new police chief Vanessa Morton, an African-American woman with 20 years of experience and a doctorate in criminal justice. "Now, they're logged in a public database with transparent tracking. No more burying patterns of misconduct." Morton had been recruited from outside the department specifically to lead the reform efforts. A respected figure in law enforcement circles for her work on community policing and departmental accountability, she brought both credibility and expertise to a department struggling to rebuild public trust. "What happened at Sergeant Major Washington's funeral was a symptom of deeper problems," she told the city council during her first presentation as chief. "Addressing those problems requires structural change, not just removing one officer or implementing superficial training. We're rebuilding this department from the ground up, with accountability and community service as our foundation." The Washington Protocol, as it came to be known, was adopted by police departments in 17 states within a year. Named in honor of both General Washington and his father, it established clear guidelines for de-escalation, verification of identity claims, and consequences for officers who escalated situations based on racial profiling. The protocol wasn't just a set of policies. It represented a fundamental shift in approach to policing. It emphasized service over authority, protection over control, and recognized that the power entrusted to officers came with a corresponding responsibility to use that power judiciously and equitably. Inside the prison system, Raymond Keller found that his badge offered no protection. His first weeks at Rockland State Penitentiary were spent in protective custody, separated from the general population for his own safety. The irony wasn't lost on him. Now, he was the one who needed protection from those he had once held power over. His cell in the protective custody unit was small and sparse: a metal bed bolted to the wall, a stainless steel toilet sink combination, a narrow desk and stool. The walls were bare concrete, the window a narrow slit of reinforced glass that provided more tantalizing glimpse than actual view of the outside world. For 23 hours a day, this space defined his existence, a stark contrast to the freedom he had once taken for granted. "Former cops don't do well in prison," explained Dr. Marcus Reynolds, a criminologist who studied Keller's case as part of a broader examination of law enforcement officers who crossed the line to criminality. "They represent the system that put most inmates there. Add in the racial component of Keller's crime, and you have a particularly volatile situation." Reynolds had interviewed Keller 6 months into his sentence, finding a man still struggling to come to terms with his new reality. He vacillated between defiance and despair, Reynolds noted in his published study. There were moments when he still justified his actions, still clung to the narrative that he was simply doing his job. But those moments would give way to a crushing awareness of all he had lost: his freedom, his identity, his future. Keller's appeals were denied one after another. The evidence against him was too overwhelming, the pattern too established, the sentencing too justified given the severity of his actions. His former supporters gradually disappeared. Even the police union, which had initially helped fund his defense, distanced itself from his case. "What Keller did harmed every good officer in this country," said Union President Michael Barnes in a statement following the denial of Keller's final appeal. "We cannot and will not defend actions that betray the badge." 3 years into his sentence, Keller granted his first and only interview to journalist Sophia Chen, whose investigation had helped expose his history of misconduct. Chen had continued to follow the case even after the trial, reporting on the broader changes it had inspired and maintaining contact with key figures involved. The interview took place in a small room at Rockland State Penitentiary under the watchful eye of corrections officers. Gone was the arrogant officer who had drawn his weapon on a general. In his place sat a haggard man in a prison jumpsuit, his eyes hollow, his shoulders slumped in defeat. "I never thought I'd end up here," he told Chen, his voice barely above a whisper, as if the admission itself was painful. "I always thought I was one of the good ones." "When did you realize you weren't?" Chen asked bluntly, her notepad open before her, her pen poised. Keller was silent for a long moment, his gaze fixed on the scarred surface of the table between them. "Maybe I still haven't fully accepted it," he finally admitted. "But I've had a lot of time to think about that day, about all the days before it. I didn't see General Washington as a person first. I saw him as a threat because that's what I'd trained myself to see." "Trained yourself or were trained to see?" Chen pressed, her journalist's instinct detecting a deeper story. "Both," Keller acknowledged, meeting her eyes for the first time. "The department had a culture, sure, but I chose to embrace it. I chose to see what I wanted to see, and now I'm paying for it." When asked if he had a message for General Washington, Keller shook his head. "Nothing I could say would undo what I did to him and his family on the worst day of their lives. Nothing would erase the fear I saw in his mother's eyes. I don't deserve their forgiveness, and I'm not asking for it." The interview aired nationally, sparking renewed conversations about police reform, implicit bias, and the culture that had allowed Keller to operate unchecked for so long. But unlike the initial coverage of the incident, which had focused primarily on outrage and accountability, these discussions increasingly centered on prevention and systemic change. Meanwhile, General Marcus Washington had returned to his duties at the Pentagon, though his experience had changed him. He had always been aware of the realities faced by Black Americans in encounters with law enforcement. His father had prepared him for such realities from an early age. But experiencing it so directly in such a public way had transformed his perspective. In the months following Keller's sentencing, he had received numerous requests to speak about his experience, to lend his voice to various causes and movements. He declined most, preferring to focus on his military responsibilities and his mother's well-being. But he did establish the Washington Family Foundation, dedicated to criminal justice reform and support for families affected by police misconduct. "My father believed in this country's potential to live up to its ideals," he explained at the foundation's launch, speaking to a small gathering of supporters rather than holding a large, media-friendly event. He served to protect those ideals, even when America didn't always extend them to him. This foundation continues his work by holding our institutions accountable to their highest purpose. The foundation offered legal aid, counseling services, and advocacy training for communities often marginalized by the justice system. It worked quietly but effectively, focusing on structural change rather than publicity, embodying the same dignified determination that had characterized Washington's response to the gun pointed at his chest at his father's funeral. Catherine Washington, despite her advancing age, became an unexpected advocate herself. Though she had initially preferred to grieve privately, away from the media attention that had engulfed her family, she gradually accepted invitations to speak about her experience, not to fan the flames of outrage, but to humanize the conversation about policing and race. She spoke to police academy cadets about her experience, putting a human face to the consequences of biased policing. Her presentations weren't angry or accusatory. They were measured, thoughtful reflections on what it meant to be on the receiving end of unwarranted suspicion and aggression. "I'm not here to make you feel guilty," she would tell them, her voice gentle but firm, her presence commanding despite her physical frailty. "I'm here to make you think, to make you pause before you act on fear or assumption. My William served this country for decades. My son continues to serve. All we ask is that you serve all citizens with equal respect." Her talks became so impactful that they were incorporated into police training programs nationwide. Cadets would watch the video of her rising from her wheelchair to defend her son, then hear directly from her about the cost of that moment, not just to her family, but to the community's trust in law enforcement. "When you put on that uniform," she would say, "you become more than an individual. You become a symbol of authority, of protection. How you use that authority, whether with wisdom or with fear, shapes how people see not just you, but all who wear the uniform. Choose wisdom. Choose to see people as people first, not as potential threats." 5 years after the incident, a documentary titled Stars and Bars: The Washington Incident and American Justice premiered at the Sundance Film Festival. Directed by acclaimed filmmaker Jordan Ellis, it traced not just the confrontation and trial, but the systemic issues that had created an officer like Raymond Keller and the changes implemented in response to his case. Ellis, known for thought-provoking examinations of American social issues, had spent 2 years researching and filming, conducting interviews with dozens of people connected to the case and placing it in the broader context of race, authority, and accountability in America. The film featured interviews with James Rodriguez, who had rebuilt his life as a youth counselor after testifying against his former partner, Teresa Mendez, whose early warnings about Keller had been ignored, and numerous other officers, experts, and community members connected to the case. Most powerfully, it included Catherine Washington's last interview before her peaceful passing at age 88. Seated in her living room, surrounded by photos of her husband and son, she reflected on the legacy of what had happened with the wisdom and perspective that only someone who had lived through 8 decades of American history could offer. "William used to tell me that change doesn't come from comfort," she said, her eyes bright despite her frail appearance. "It comes from confronting what's wrong and having the courage to demand better. What happened to Marcus that day was terrible, but the good that's come from it, the reforms, the awareness, the accountability, that's William's legacy too. That's what he fought for." Her words, delivered with the quiet certainty of someone who had seen both the worst and the best of America, brought many viewers to tears. They captured something essential about the Washington family's response to injustice: a refusal to be defined by victimhood, an insistence on channeling trauma into positive change, a fundamentally American belief that systems could be improved through persistent, principled pressure. General Washington declined to be interviewed for the film, preferring to keep the focus on the systemic issues rather than his personal experience. But he did provide a written statement that closed the documentary. "My father taught me that a uniform, whether military or law enforcement, is a commitment to service above self. It is not a license for power, but a responsibility to justice." What happened at his funeral was a failure of that commitment. What has happened since is a recommitment to its highest purpose. The work continues as it must until no American lives in fear of those sworn to protect them. The documentary won numerous awards and became required viewing in criminal justice programs and police academies across the country. Its unflinching examination of how bias becomes policy and how policy becomes tragedy opened eyes and changed minds. It presented no easy answers, no simplistic narratives of heroes and villains, but rather a complex, nuanced exploration of the systems that shape individual actions and their consequences. As for Raymond Keller, he continued to serve his sentence at Rockland State Penitentiary, largely forgotten by the world outside. The man who had once wielded power so recklessly now had none at all. His days were regimented, his movements restricted, his freedom forfeited through his own actions. 7 years into his sentence, he was transferred to the prison's general population. Despite concerns for his safety, he adjusted, keeping to himself and avoiding confrontation. Some reported that he participated in the prison's restorative justice program, though he never spoke publicly about it. The program, which brought offenders face-to-face with victims or victim representatives to understand the impact of their crimes, was particularly challenging for Keller. He had to confront not just the harm he had caused the Washington family, but the broader damage his actions had inflicted on community trust in law enforcement. "It's harder for someone like Keller," explained Dr. Amara Johnson, who facilitated the program. "Most participants can separate their actions from their identity, but for a former officer, the crime was committed as part of that identity. Acknowledging the harm means questioning a fundamental part of who they understood themselves to be." A prison chaplain who worked with him noted that Keller had found a kind of peace in acceptance, not excusing what he did, but acknowledging it fully and trying to understand the damage he caused. Whether that understanding constituted true redemption remained a question only Keller himself could answer. But the justice system had rendered its verdict, and Raymond Keller would indeed spend what amounted to a life sentence behind bars, a consequence he had never imagined when he drew his weapon on a grieving son at a funeral, blinded by a prejudice he hadn't even recognized within himself. 10 years after the incident, on the anniversary of Sergeant Major William Washington's funeral, a new monument was unveiled at Arlington National Cemetery. Commissioned by a bipartisan group of lawmakers and military leaders, it honored not just Sergeant Major Washington's service, but the principle that had guided his life and his son's: equal justice under law. The monument, a simple but elegant marble column, stood near the section where Sergeant Major Washington had been laid to rest. Its creation had been the subject of debate. Some argued that singling out one veteran this way set a problematic precedent, while others contended that Washington's story represented something larger than one man's service. In the end, the monument's supporters prevailed, arguing that it commemorated not just an individual, but a principle central to American democracy, a principle too often honored in the breach rather than the observance. General Marcus Washington, now retired from active duty and serving as a special advisor to the president on military and civil rights issues, stood beside the monument as it was revealed. At 68, he remained an imposing figure, his military bearing undiminished by retirement, his composure still remarkable to those who remembered the dignity with which he had faced a loaded weapon a decade earlier. The simple marble column bore an inscription that captured the legacy of what had happened that day in Lakeside. "True courage stands firm in the face of both battlefield peril and systemic injustice. True service protects not just a nation's borders, but the dignity of all who dwell within them." The ceremony was attended by military leaders, civil rights advocates, police reform activists, and a new generation of officers trained under the Washington Protocol. Among them was James Rodriguez, now the director of a youth mentorship program that worked to build positive relationships between law enforcement and communities of color. "I carry what happened that day with me," Rodriguez told a reporter after the ceremony. "Not as a burden anymore, but as a responsibility. My silence then contributed to the problem. My voice now is part of the solution." Visitors to Arlington would stop at the monument, read those words, and remember not just the decorated veteran buried nearby, but the day when his son faced a different kind of threat with the same unwavering dignity. And they would reflect on how one moment of injustice, captured and exposed, had helped bend the arc of history just a little closer toward justice. As the ceremony concluded, General Washington placed a hand on the monument, a private moment of connection with the father who had shaped his character and whose funeral had unexpectedly become a catalyst for change. A reporter, observing from a respectful distance, later asked if the general felt that justice had truly been served in his case. "Justice isn't an endpoint," Washington replied thoughtfully. the wisdom of his years evident in both his words and the measured way he delivered them. It's a continuous commitment. What happened to me that day happens to people without cameras, without rank, without witnesses every day in this country. True justice will be served when that's no longer the case. Until then, we keep working. And so the legacy of that confrontation at a funeral continued to unfold in reformed police departments, in new laws, in changed mindsets, and in the life sentence of a man who had never imagined his actions would cost him his freedom. Raymond Keller, prisoner number 47921, watched a news segment about the monument dedication from the common room of Rockland State Penitentiary. At 51, his hair had turned completely gray, his face lined with the harsh realities of prison life and the weight of his own regrets. He sat apart from the other inmates, as was his habit, his eyes fixed on the television screen as General Washington's face appeared. As Washington spoke about the meaning of the monument, about his father's legacy and the changes that had come from that day at the funeral, Keller's expression remained unreadable. But those seated nearby reported that he watched the entire segment in silence, and when it ended, he returned to his cell without a word. That night, a guard doing rounds found Keller sitting on the edge of his bunk, staring at the wall where he had taped a single newspaper clipping. Not of his own case, but of Catherine Washington's obituary from 3 years earlier. In it, she was described as a woman who stood up even when standing was difficult, a line that captured both her physical courage that day at the funeral and the moral courage she had shown in its aftermath. The guard, a young officer who had been trained under the Washington Protocol, paused at the cell door. "You okay, Keller?" he asked, more out of procedural necessity than genuine concern. Keller looked up, seeming almost surprised by the question. "I saw a threat where there wasn't one," he said quietly, more to himself than to the guard. "I saw a threat because that's what I expected to see, and it cost me everything. Whether this represented regret, respect, or something else entirely, only Keller knew. But as he continued to serve his sentence, the world outside moved forward, changed irrevocably by the moment when he had drawn his weapon on the wrong man, a man whose dignity in the face of injustice had exposed not just one officer's prejudice, but an entire system's failure. And in police academies across the country, new cadets watched the footage of that day, studied the reforms it had sparked, and took an oath that now explicitly included a commitment to equal justice regardless of race, status, or circumstance. They pledged to be the officers Raymond Keller had failed to be, guardians of peace rather than enforcers of bias, protectors of dignity rather than agents of fear. As one academy instructor told his cadets while showing the footage of General Washington standing tall with a gun pointed at his chest, "Your badge gives you authority, but how you use that authority reveals your character. Choose wisely, because the consequences of the wrong choice can last a lifetime, yours and others." 15 years into his sentence, Raymond Keller became eligible for his first parole hearing. The boardroom was packed with media, activists, and law enforcement representatives. This case, which had transformed policing protocols nationwide, still commanded attention even after all these years. Keller entered wearing a standard prison jumpsuit, his hair now completely gray, his posture stooped from years of confinement. At 56, he looked far older than his years, the toll of imprisonment etched into every line on his face. The parole board chair, Dr. Evelyn Carter, addressed him directly. "Mr. Keller, you've served 15 years of your 22-year sentence. You're eligible for parole consideration today. This board has reviewed your prison record, which shows minimal disciplinary issues and participation in several rehabilitation programs. Do you have a statement for the board?" Keller cleared his throat, his voice raspy from disuse. "I've had 15 years to think about what I did," he began slowly. His hands clasped tightly before him to control their trembling. 15 years to replay that moment when I drew my weapon on General Washington. I've tried to understand why I did it, why I saw a threat where none existed. The only honest answer I can give is that I saw what I expected to see. I saw a black man and assumed criminality because that's what my biases taught me to see." He paused, swallowing hard. The room was silent, every person present intent on his words. This was not the defiant officer who had stood trial, nor even the subdued prisoner who had given that single interview years earlier. This was a man who had been stripped of everything: status, freedom, identity, and forced to confront the truth of his actions. "I can't undo what I did. I can't give General Washington and his mother back that day of grief that I made infinitely worse. I can't erase the fear I caused or the trust I destroyed. All I can say is that I understand now. I see now. And I know that no amount of time served will ever fully pay for what I took from them and from the community I was sworn to protect." The room was silent as Keller continued. "I don't ask for forgiveness. I don't even ask for parole, though I admit I fear dying in this place. What I ask is that my case continues to be a warning to others with a badge and a gun, that power without wisdom, authority without compassion, is a danger to everyone." When asked about his plans if released, Keller spoke of quiet anonymity, of possibly working with police reform advocates to share his perspective, of trying to give meaning to the years he had left. "But I understand," he concluded, his voice barely audible in the hushed room. "If this board and the Washington family feel that justice requires me to serve my full sentence, some debts can never be fully repaid." The board deliberated for less than an hour before delivering their decision: parole denied. The primary reason cited was the ongoing need for the sentence to reflect the severity of the offense and its impact on the victims and society. As Keller was led back to his cell, the news quickly spread. Reactions were mixed. Some felt that 15 years was enough punishment for a crime that, while severe, hadn't resulted in physical injury. Others maintained that the sentence was appropriate given the abuse of authority and the racial component of the offense. "The issue isn't whether Keller has been rehabilitated," argued civil rights attorney Malcolm Green on a national news program discussing the parole decision. "The issue is whether his punishment adequately reflects the severity of his crime. He didn't just threaten one man, he betrayed the public trust. He didn't just draw his weapon without cause, he exposed a system that had protected such behavior for years." General Marcus Washington, now in his 70s but still commanding respect wherever he went, was asked about the parole decision during a speaking engagement at the National Constitution Center. The auditorium was filled to capacity, the audience a mix of students, legal professionals, and ordinary citizens drawn by the general's reputation and the continuing relevance of his experience. "Mr. Keller's freedom is not my concern," he replied thoughtfully, his voice still strong despite his advancing years. "The freedom of every citizen to live without fear of those sworn to protect them, that is my concern. If his continued incarceration serves as a reminder of that principle, then perhaps justice is being served. But true justice would be a world where such reminders are no longer necessary." The Washington Family Foundation continued its work, focusing increasingly on police reform, civilian oversight, and support for families affected by police misconduct. Its annual report that year noted that complaints of racial profiling had decreased significantly in departments that had adopted the Washington Protocol, though disparities still existed in many jurisdictions. "The work continues," the report concluded, echoing General Washington's frequent refrain: "Justice is not an achievement but a constant commitment." 20 years after the incident, as Raymond Keller approached the end of his sentence, a new generation of police officers had been trained under protocols that emerged from his case. Many had never known a time when body cameras weren't standard, when civilian oversight boards didn't have real authority, when implicit bias training wasn't mandatory. For these officers, the Washington incident wasn't just a case study. It was a foundational story that shaped their understanding of their role and responsibilities. They had watched the footage in training, had heard Catherine Washington's words, had studied the failures of judgment and system that had led to a decorated officer facing a gun at his father's funeral. A study published in the Journal of Criminal Justice found that departments implementing the Washington Protocol showed a 47% reduction in use of force incidents involving minority citizens and a 62% reduction in civilian complaints. The transformation hasn't been perfect, noted Dr. Lisa Hernandez, the study's lead author, but it represents one of the most significant shifts in American policing practices in decades. And it all traces back to one incident, one officer, and one family's insistence on accountability. Raymond Keller was eventually released after serving 20 years of his 22-year sentence, receiving credit for good behavior and participation in prison education programs. He emerged from Rockland State Penitentiary, a man fundamentally changed by his incarceration, his notoriety, and his reckoning with the damage his actions had caused. Now in his 60s, gray and stooped, he left prison with little fanfare. There were no cameras to record his first steps of freedom, no family waiting to embrace him. His ex-wife had divorced him shortly after his conviction. His former colleagues had long since distanced themselves from his case. He settled in a small apartment in a town far from Lakeside, living on a modest pension that had survived his conviction. He kept to himself, rarely venturing out. His name changed legally to escape the notoriety that still clung to his case. Occasionally, he would speak to criminal justice classes or police cadet training sessions via video link, never in person. He would tell his story without excuses, would answer questions about what had led him to that moment at the funeral, and would emphasize the consequences, not just for him, but for the Washington family, for the community, for the profession he had disgraced. "I thought the badge made me untouchable," he would tell them, his face filling the screen, the lines of age and regret clearly visible. "I thought my judgment couldn't be questioned. I was wrong, and that wrongness cost me everything. Don't make my mistake. See people first, not threats. Question your assumptions. Remember that authority is given to you by the community, all of the community, and can be taken away when you abuse it." His words carried the weight of hard-earned wisdom, of consequences fully realized, of a life forever defined by its worst moment. General Marcus Washington, for his part, continued to serve his country long after his military retirement. His foundation expanded its work, establishing scholarships for minority students pursuing careers in law enforcement and criminal justice reform. He wrote a memoir titled Standing Tall, Dignity in the Face of Injustice, which became required reading in many police academies and military leadership programs. In the book's final chapter, he addressed the question he was most frequently asked, whether he had forgiven Raymond Keller. "Forgiveness is a personal journey, not a public performance," he wrote. "What matters more than my forgiveness is the change that has come from that day. If officers now think twice before drawing their weapons, if departments now hold their members accountable, if communities now have more tools to ensure equal justice, then perhaps something meaningful has emerged from that moment when I stood at my father's funeral with a gun pointed at my chest." The book became not just a bestseller but a cultural touchstone, read by people across political divides, assigned in university courses ranging from criminal justice to ethics, discussed in book clubs and community forums. Washington's measured tone, his refusal to demonize while still insisting on accountability, created a space for conversation that transcended the polarization that so often characterized discussions of race and policing. He concluded with a reflection on his father's legacy. "My father believed that America's promise was worth fighting for, even when America failed to extend that promise to him. He fought external enemies abroad and systemic injustice at home with the same unwavering dignity. The true measure of his legacy and of the changes that have come from what happened at his funeral will be a day when no American lives in fear of those sworn to protect them." when justice is truly blind to color, and when authority is exercised with wisdom rather than bias. Until that day, the work continues. And so it did continue. Long after Raymond Keller had served his sentence, long after General Washington had joined his parents in rest, long after the cameras had turned to new stories and new injustices, the work continued in reformed police departments, in civilian oversight boards, in courtrooms, in classrooms, and community meetings across the country. The work continued because one moment of injustice, captured and exposed, had revealed a deeper truth: that no badge, no uniform, no authority could ever place someone above accountability, and that dignity in the face of injustice could sometimes change not just a moment, but a system. 25 years after the incident, on the silver anniversary of what had come to be known simply as the Washington case, a symposium was held at Georgetown Law School, titled "From Incident to Reform: The Washington Legacy and American Policing." It brought together legal scholars, police administrators, civil rights advocates, and a new generation of leaders shaped by the changes that had emerged from that confrontation at a funeral. The keynote speaker was Marcus Washington, Jr., the nephew who had recorded the viral video that day, now a respected federal judge known for his thoughtful opinions on cases involving police authority and civil rights. Standing at the podium where his uncle had spoken years earlier, he reflected on the long arc from that day to the present. "I was 26 years old when I recorded that video," he began. "Just a software engineer visiting home for my grandfather's funeral. I had no idea that pressing record on my phone would set in motion events that would transform policing in this country. I just knew that my uncle, a 4-star general, had a gun pointed at his chest for no reason other than the color of his skin, and someone needed to document it." He paused, looking out at the assembled audience. The Washington case is often taught as a story of justice served, of accountability achieved, and it was that, to a degree that few expected at the time. But it was also a story of a family's grief compounded, of a sacred moment desecrated, of a system that had failed long before that day at the cemetery. The audience listened in silence as he continued. "My grandmother, Catherine Washington, once told me that true change doesn't come from comfort. It comes from confronting what's wrong and having the courage to demand better. The Washington Protocol, the departmental reforms, the national conversation that emerged from that day, all of these were necessary and important, but they were responses to a failure that should never have occurred." He concluded with a challenge that echoed his uncle's consistent message over the decades. The work continues, not just in policing, but in every institution where bias can corrupt authority, where power can override dignity. My grandfather believed America could live up to its promises. My uncle devoted his life to that belief. Now it falls to all of us to continue that work, to ensure that what happened that day at Lakeside Memorial Gardens never happens again, not just to a general at a funeral, but to any citizen in any circumstance. As the symposium concluded, as papers were presented and panels discussed the legal, social, and political implications of the Washington case, one fundamental truth remained clear. Raymond Keller had drawn his weapon on the wrong man that day. He had seen a threat where there was only grief, criminality where there was only dignity, and for that mistake, born of bias, perpetuated by arrogance, he had indeed paid with decades of his life. But the true cost of that moment extended far beyond one man's freedom. It had exposed the fragility of justice, the persistence of prejudice, and the courage required to stand tall when systems fail. It had reminded America that its ideals were not self-executing, but required constant vigilance, constant improvement, constant commitment. And in that reminder lay the true legacy of the day when a racist cop pulled a gun on a black general at a funeral and eventually rotted in prison for life. If this story moved you, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. Share it with someone who needs to understand the importance of accountability, the power of dignity, and the ongoing work of justice in our society. And remember, one person standing tall can sometimes change an entire system. Until next time.